What does state management actually mean? And why is it so difficult? To try to answer this, we have to travel back in time. There was a time when we did not manage state in the browser at all. The server would manage state and produce a static HTML page for our users to consume. For example, a list of users. As with all new technology, new possibilities emerge. One such technology was Ajax. It allowed us to put a script on the page and fetch data from the server without refreshing the page. With the responded data, we could dynamically create new HTML content, and it was a huge leap in user experience. But creating these experiences often resulted in spaghetti code. We had no good abstraction for containing the relationship between state and a piece of UI. The abstraction view model, or controller was created. It flipped things around, meaning that we did not sprinkle scripts on the existing HTML. We created an actual JavaScript application that was responsible for producing the HTML. This abstraction and the concept of templates was another huge leap in creating user experiences. We now had a tight relationship between state and the HTML that was produced from it. But we were still not happy. All the models, collections, services, providers, and whatnot, there had to be one simple abstraction that could manage state and produce a user interface. This concept became the component. With a component, we have a simple abstraction that can manage state in an infinitely complex UI structure. This abstraction is found in most modern frameworks, it being Angular, Vue, or React. They all have a concept of components which can hold state and produce a user interface. But the component does not solve state management completely. Whenever you introduce state to a component, you have to ask yourself some questions. Imagine you grab a user in a component. Do you need that user to live beyond the lifetime of the component? Because when the component unmounts, the user is gone. Another question you have to ask yourself is what other components is interested in the user. If you fetch the user in a component out of reach from other components, you will need to move the fetching of the user to a component higher up the hierarchy. A third question you need to ask yourself is, does any children of this component need to change the state? Maybe some nested component needs to trigger fetching the user. If that is the case, you will need to pass down the ability to do so, possibly several levels down. Or some solutions allows you to trigger events. When using components, the layout of the UI influences the access to and lifetime of state. Sometimes this is a good thing, other times it's not a good thing. Overmind introduces a layer on top of your components. Just like a component, it also manages state. Any component in your component hierarchy can access the state in Overmind. The state stored in Overmind is different than the state in your components. It is not affected by the life cycle of the components. And any component can reach any of the state inside Overmind. Also trigger the logic defined to change that state. You can say that Overmind handles your application state, while your components handles their own state, if any. But managing state is not only about storing and changing it. We fetch data from the server, we run conditional logic, we run logic in parallel, we transform data, we talk to the APIs of the tools we install. At the end of the day, all these things typically result in state changes, which is why Overmind considers them part of state management. That means Overmind is not only about storing and changing out state values, it is also about structuring code and running side effects. So why was Overmind created when there already are several state management solutions out there? It was created to make the experience better, and it does that by using new technology. Proxies is a new JavaScript feature which allows us to automatically track and optimize component rendering, amongst other things. This improves the experience for you as a developer because there is less to think about and manage. Overmind is written in TypeScript with the goal of creating an awesome typing experience. TypeScript improves the developer experience by understanding what state is available in your application, what actions you can run, and what side effects you have defined. It also helps the experience by telling you what components break because you changed your state structure, your logic, or whatever. Often when writing TypeScript, you feel that you are helping TypeScript out more than TypeScript is helping you. That is not the case with Overmind. Last but not least, Overmind also improves the developer experience with its development tool. It is a standalone application that helps answering common questions like, what state do I actually have in this application? What actually happens when the application loads, this button is clicked, or that checkbox is checked? How did the interaction actually affect my components? And what state is actually being accessed at any given time? These are just some of the questions that can be answered, and the tool is constantly evolving. Now that you have gotten an introduction to why Overmind exists, let's have a look at how you use the library. Okay, so I have my terminal open here, and we are going to write a tiny, silly application just so that you get a feel of what Overmind is all about. So first we need to initialize a package.json file here so that we can do npm install. We need Overmind, and I'm going to use a parcel bundler here. And while that's installing, we need to create an index.html file in our project. And let's just use this shortcut here. And we're going to open a file, which is a TypeScript file. And if you don't know TypeScript, don't feel intimidated, because Overmind is written in TypeScript for you to not care that much about TypeScript. It's very focused on minimal typing to give you the most benefits. Okay, of course we also need our main file here, so let's create the folder and let's insert index.ts and let's just log something out here, hello world. Cool. And last but not least, we need to go to our package.json file to insert our start script, which is just parcel index.html. Okay, let's see what happens when we fire up this thing. Let's go back to our code. And yeah, now parcel sees that we're using TypeScript, so it installs it automatically. And it's done. And if we go to the browser, refresh, we see hello world. Awesome. So we can actually start coding now. First of all, we are going to use the pure or low level version of Overmind. We're not installing like the React or Angular or Vue version, because I want to show you actually how Overmind works. So typically you would install Overmind React, Overmind Angular, or Overmind Vue to get going with your application. But as you will see here, you will see how Overmind actually works. So first of all, we need to instantiate an Overmind application. And we do that by creating an app folder. This is just the convention. And we have an index file there as well. So in our original file here, we are going to import app from app. And inside this index file, we are going to import Overmind. We're also going to import a type called tapp from Overmind. And Overmind is basically just a configuration of your application. So let's create a config object. And then we're going to declare the typing for our application. And the way we do this is that we say declare module Overmind, and then we create an interface in here called app, and it extends tapp, where we have type of config. Now this is all you need to write to tell Overmind what your application is all about in terms of typing. And then we create our app instance, passing in the config, and we can just export that. Okay, so now we have our application set up, and we should probably introduce something here. So let's create a new file called state, and we are going to export title state, which is a string, and let's name it hello world from Overmind. Okay, and then we have to import that state to our application and add it to our config, just like that. So what we're seeing now in our main index file is that when we point to app, we get help from TypeScript. So we have state, and when we look at state, we can see that we have the title here. So let's just log that out for make sure that everything works, and I save that. And when I refresh the browser now, we see that we have hello world from Overmind. But we also see a WebSocket error here. And that is because Overmind by default connects to the development tool. So let's try to fire that up. I'm going back to my terminal here. And you can actually fire up the Overmind DevTools, but just writing npx Overmind DevTools. Now, npx is like an npm package executor, and you can do it like this, or you can actually install Overmind DevTools and then insert it as a script, just like we did with Parcel. But let's see what happens here now. It fires up the DevTools. Let's just make it a little bit bigger. And then when we refresh the application, it connects, and we can see that we have hello world from Overmind. So let's move back to our application here, because what we want to do is change this title state. But before we do that, we can render this title state to the DOM. So let's create like h1 ID title. So we have an element where we can insert it. And then we're going to create a render function. And this render function will document query selector title, and then inner HTML equals app state title. And then we're going to run this render function. So now we can see that we have the title inside the DOM. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to change the state of this title, and we want the UI to automatically update itself. So first of all, let's try to change the state. So what we're going to do is just create like a timeout here, just so that we can see that the UI actually updates. Let's give it a second. And then let's point to app state title equals new title. First of all, we can see here that we're getting a TypeScript error because our title state is a constant. We have actually told our application that this title shouldn't be replaced. So what we can do is just export it as let instead, and then it's perfectly okay. So this is just a nice way to tell the typing that you have some state that you don't want to be replaced, or you have some state that you actually will allow being replaced. So when we refresh here now, we see that we get a new error. And we get an error about mutating the path title. And this is really important because in Overmind, you can't just change the state wherever you want. There is a specific way to actually change the state of the application. So let's have a quick look at that now. What we do is we create a new file called actions. And inside this actions file, we are going to import a type called action from Overmind. We are going to export change title, and this is an action. And what you define here is actually a function. And this function receives one argument called action. And what you want to do is actually return this action, but you return it by extending its functionality. So by default, it doesn't do anything. But when we look into this object, we can see that we have several methods for doing logic. And one of those methods is mutate. So if we have a look at this now, we can see that all these methods takes a function, and that function receives an argument called context. Now, typically you wouldn't use context directly like this, you would destructure it. And one of the things you get on the context is the state. So if we go to state here, we can see again that we get help from TypeScript, and we'll change it to new title. We'll save that, make sure that we import our actions here, actions, and add it to our config. We'll save that. And inside our index file, we're not going to change the state directly. We're going to say app actions. And now we see that we have changed title here. We're going to call that. So let's fire up the app again. Let's refresh. And as you can see, it didn't actually change the title. But if we move into the DevTools now, we can see that, oh, it actually has changed the title to new title. And if we go to this tab called actions, we can see that we actually ran an action called change title, and it did a mutation. And that mutation was a set mutation on the title path with the value new title. So we know that the state has actually been changed and everything's okay. And as I said in the beginning, is that we are actually just using Overmind here. Typically, you would use the Overmind React, Angular, or Vue package, which exposes a way to connect your components to Overmind, which does all the tracking of state access and rendering and everything for you. But just to give you a simple understanding of how this works, we are going to build this ourselves. So first of all, we need to create a mutation listener. And what we're going to do is that when we call this render function, we are going to track the access to state. So we are going to say app track state, and now it actually starts tracking state. And then we let our render logic run, and then we say paths by clearing the tracking of the state by giving it the track ID. And then we can check, do we have a mutation listener? If that is the case, we can say mutation listener update, and we give it the path or the paths. And if we don't have it, we are going to create a mutation listener by saying add mutation listener paths, and then a callback of what do we want to happen whenever there's a mutation. And that is to render again. So I saved now, and you already saw what happened. Let's refresh. And now you can see it actually running. So what happens here is that whenever you render something in a component, Overmind will track the access to the state. And the first time it tracks this state, it will create a mutation listener, where the component will get re-rendered every time a mutation matches whatever you're tracking. And the reason you're updating the mutation listener on every render is because you might have conditional logic here, meaning that for each render you might be tracking different things, which is why we need to update the listener. But again, this is not something you have to think about when you write your application, but it's really nice to know how this actually works under the hood, meaning that Overmind can easily be adapted to work with any other Vue type of layer. But yeah, this was basically what I wanted to show in this introduction. There is of course more to learn about Overmind, but I hope this gave you some insight into how it works and motivates you to keep diving into what Overmind is all about.